Shalom, welcome to Rob on the Rock. I'm Rob Vanhoff, and I want to talk about a passage from Exodus 12 where it says the Pesach, or the Pascha, is a shimmurim l'Adonai, a vigil or a watching for Adonai. And we're going to approach this from Yeshua's instruction in Luke 12 concerning servants waiting for their master and what blessing is in store for those servants who await their master's return. Let's take a look. We're going to be reading from the NASB here of Luke 12, 35 through 38, where Yeshua instructs us concerning the servant's heart, or the attitude that we are to have in cultivation of wakefulness, vigilance, alertness with respect to his return. And that this attitude that we are to have as servants awaiting our master is the framework for our lives. It is more important than us following the political or economic or entertainment or educational cultures in this world. Let's look at this passage together, and I'll unpack it as we go. He says, "Be dressed in readiness and keep your lamps lit. Be like men who are waiting for their master when he returns from the wedding feast, so that they may immediately open the door to him when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master will find on the alert when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will gird himself to serve and have them recline at the table, and will come up and wait on them. Whether he comes in the second watch or even in the third, and finds them so, blessed are those slaves." That's Luke 12, 35 through 38 in the NASB. A few things we want to point out is the main contrast here is between the master, or the Adon, and the slaves, the Avadim. So the Adon, or the Kyrios, or the Eved and Doulos. Those are the two contrasts here. Is that if you are a servant, that means you are obligated to the words of your master and to obey him. Where it starts here and says, "Be dressed in readiness," Yeshua is actually alluding to the passage in Exodus 12, where it instructs those first Pesach observers in Egypt to gird their loins and be ready to go. Be like men who are waiting for their master when he returns from the wedding feast. Here Yeshua says, be like those. Be those waiting for their master to return. That's our basic marching order. And it says twice, how blessed are these slaves who are found alert upon the master's return. And this word alert, we've talked about in another video. It's from Gregoreo, where we get the word Gregorian, or the name Greg. It means to be vigilant, to be watchful, to be awake and alert, and watching, watching for something specific. We're watching for Yeshua's return. What does it mean here when he says that the master will gird himself to serve? Well, because when he comes from a wedding feast, that is a time of joy. Returning of the master, coming from a wedding feast, he's going to be so full of joy, so full of goodness. He's just going to want to share with those servants who have been faithful to him. He's going to sit them down and he's going to bless them. He's going to bless them with a lot of good stuff that he brings with him. And his enthusiasm to share with them will be so overwhelming. He'll just take over and set them down, and they will just shift into being the recipients of his blessing. That's what this means, that those servants are going to be blessed, because he's going to return with immense blessings. And his only desire at that point is to share, to fully share those blessings with his faithful servants. We're going to transition here and think about this parable, and specifically in terms of the Pesach, because with the Pascha, That's the Aramaic word for Pesach. We are taught by the commandment itself to have this as an emphasis, this watchfulness and this alertness for this season. And we hold to our master's words. That means we are keeping our hearts vigilant. We're discerning what is the word of God and what is not the word of God. Because it's the doctrines and traditions of men that Yeshua teaches us are like leaven. And that leaven creeps in to where a person stops being able to discern between what is the word of God and what is the tradition of men, because it's all blended together. That's a person that cannot discern the leaven or doctrine. So Exodus 12:11 says, let your loins be girded. That's what Yeshua cites in Luke 12, is this: be ready to go, be ready on a moment's notice, be quick and actively watching. In verse 42 of Exodus 12, the Pascha is called a shimmurim, and then it says twice that it's a shimmurim l'Adonai, unto the Lord, a vigil or watch for Adonai, a shimmurim l'Adonai. What is a shimmurim? It's from the verb lishmo, but it's an intense watching, an intense guarding. And I understand this to mean it's keeping a sharp distinction, an active, sharp distinction, that's the word of God, between God's eternal kingdom, power and glory, and the reality of God's eternal kingdom, his power and his glory, and distinguishing that and differentiating God's eternal power from the temporal powers of the world. That's very, very important. As it says in Isaiah 40, right? The world is passing away, right? The glory of man passes away like a flower. I'm paraphrasing, but the word of the Lord abides forever. Yeshua brings the same teaching up in Matthew 16, 11, and 12, where he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And his disciples understood that he did not say, beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So Yeshua says the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees is talking about the teaching, or the didache in Greek, the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We should pause there and say, okay, well, it's clear that the teaching here is the leaven, but certainly the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't agree. Did they have a united teaching? No. The teaching here means teachings of the Pharisees or the teachings of the Sadducees. It's not a single unified teaching because, of course, we know that the Pharisees and Sadducees were not on the same page with respect to interpreting and teaching the Torah of Moses. But we are to be aware of the leaven of the doctrines of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. And I think this has crept into the Christian world in many ways. Some is, big one is the title rabbi. The title rabbi has really been adopted within believing circles as if it's somehow an authentic teaching or something like this, when in fact Yeshua says don't be called a rabbi in Matthew 23. Matthew 23, in fact, gets into great detail of what happens with the leaven. That the leaven puffs up and people stop differentiating between what is the tradition of man and what is the word of God. And that's exactly the problem. The Pharisees had this problem, the Sadducees have this problem, and even in the Christian church there's a problem. One of the greatest problems that we have in our heart, right? Jeremiah 17, it says the heart is crooked and deceitful above all. Who can know it? Why is Jeremiah the prophet saying this? Because he knows that the heart of man is deceiving. We need to be on guard. Do we know the difference between the word of God and what is commanded and what is holy? Because God called it holy. Or are we being swayed and put to sleep, or actually becoming drunk or puffed up in things that we think are holy, but in fact are not holy. Only men call them holy or set them apart. That's a big issue, and we all have to look in our own heart and say, am I discerning the Word of God from the traditions of men? Am I discerning the Word of God over against the traditions of men? Or is it a blur to me? You know, I've had a few people reach out to me recently about this teaching that's going on out there, that Yeshua didn't eat the Passover. Rather, he ate this, breaking this fast of the firstborn, which was a tradition in Galilee. And it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Only way late in some streams of Jewish tradition, way after the Second Temple period, did this tradition develop at all. And then it's even doubtful at different times and develops. But what you have is you have people who are saying that this is what Yeshua was doing, clearly against the text, like specifically Luke 22, where it says they prepared the Pascha, right, to eat the Pascha. The Pascha was being slaughtered, and so on and so forth. If you haven't seen my video on that, you can go and look at that. The point is, they're leaving the Word of God for the sake of their traditions. And that, my friend, is leaven. And that's got to go. So you can get all the leaven out of your house, but if you're teaching the leaven of the Pharisees or the leaven of the Sadducees as doctrine, then you've got a bigger problem than leaven in your home, because you're not discerning the Word of God. This is exactly what Yeshua talked about in Mark chapter 7, in Matthew 15. And it's what had the Apostle Paul, Shaul of Tarsus, go in the wrong direction. He was zealous for traditions, and he did not discern the difference between the eternal Word of God and the temporary powers of the world, the temporary powers of men, and how men create groups and they try to rally around ideas. And in so doing that, they often build up traditions, which then become governing thought patterns that override their reading of the clear, pure Word of God. So, beware of the leaven. Beware of the leaven. Yeshua makes it clear that we are to get the leaven out. We are to discern what is the Word of God, because that, my friends, endures and abides forever. Le'olam Adonai, right? Le'olam Adonai. Forever, O Adonai. Devarcha nitzav b'shamayim. Your word stands firm in the heavens. That's a passage from Psalm 119. So with all this in mind, we go back and we read our passage from Luke 12. Be dressed in readiness. Keep your lamps lit. Be like men who are waiting for their master when he returns from the wedding feast, so that they may immediately open the door to him when he comes and knocks. How do we stay alert and waiting for the master? This world is so full of fake news, sensationalism, people drunk but not with wine, the puffiness of the traditions of men, competing for attention, competing for importance, when in fact, God has expressed through his Torah, through the prophets, through the apostles, what is the truth. And we have, by his grace and providence, the Word of God to study. It's in many different languages. There's so many Bible study aids available. Stick with the Word of God, my friends, and don't be pulled away into strange doctrines that are trying to import later rabbinic ideas as backdrop for the Gospels. That's not helpful. What we need is the true, pure Word of God. Shalom.